The largest exhibition of South Africa's most internationally acclaimed artist, William Kentridge's work on African soil, has opened at the Cape Town's Norval Foundation and the Zeitz MOCAA in the mother city. Our producer Lebo Serache spoke to Kentridge, and this is how the conversation went.
William, welcome to Morning Live.
Thank you, Lebo.
Talk to us about the space that we're in. It's called the Centre for the Less Good Idea.
Yes, it is the Centre for the Less Good Idea, not the good idea. It comes from a Tswana proverb, which is, if the good doctor can't cure you, find the less good doctor. Okay. Which is to say that sometimes you have a good idea, a grand idea, but when you're working on it, in rehearsal, in the studio, in a music studio, sometimes the things you hadn't thought of at the beginning, but which arrive while you're in the process of working, you understand the project you're really working on. And things that are in the peripheries come towards the center and change the work you're doing. And so if your first idea is the good idea, these are all the less good ideas, which in fact are the central idea. So it's about it's about a belief in the process as a way of finding the meaning you are making.
You had this idea, right? I'm going to create the Centre for the Less Good Idea. And to what it is now, when you look back, was this a good idea?
It's been a very interesting idea. It's been very good for people working in the centre, and the idea of the centre has really intrigued people in other parts of the world. So we have a lot of interest from art centres in other parts saying, what is this less good idea? What is the less good idea? So I think there was a long period between knowing I wanted to do something, to have some kind of art centre, and it becoming the less good idea. Yes. And at first the less good idea sounded a really stupid name, but now it's become the name, so we live with that, and it's fine. But I think that, in the 3 years that we've been running, we've had, I think, between 300 and 400 different artists, musicians, dancers, choreographers involved with projects at the centre. And that's really the heart of it. We do twice a year. It's open for the public to see different performances and events and exhibitions. But the heart of it are the workshops, the surprising things that happen in rehearsal, in improvisations. And that's the heart of understanding how one art form, dance, can give an energy to another, to theatre, to projection, to video, and vice versa.
And has that been the case for you, given the different mediums and spaces that you function in?
It is. I mean, it was on the strength of work that I had done across different fields that I thought to start the centre. But having started the centre, there are so many ways of thinking about work of particular musicians, dancers, actors that I've come across for the first time, who are now very much part of the ensemble of performers and makers that I work with in projects, not only at the centre, but in my own practice. So in that sense, yes, in the most selfish way, it's been a completely functional, productive and wonderful thing for me.
Let's talk about teams, and you surround yourself with a great team. Why is that such an important aspect of who William Kentridge is as the artist, or William Kentridge is as the person?
I suppose that I've always worked in collaborative forms. At university, I was in a student theatre group, which was all about improvisation and people working together. If it's a drawing, in the drawing studio, it doesn't help to have anyone else there with me. I need to be in the studio doing the drawing. But as soon as it's more than that, when it starts being an animation, I need an editor, I need musicians, I need composers. When it's in theatre work, we need actors. Those are normal, all the people you would work with. But it's understanding them not simply as useful people to work next to, but as part of the energy that changes even the drawings. And that's the vital part. So many art forms today, so many practices aren't solitary activities, but are communal in one form or another. And it was really expanding the way I worked in my own private studio into this larger sphere that the centre represents.
Yeah. But with you as well, there's a Philip Miller in there as well. There's the video editor as well. What is it about their work that drew you to them, or what is it that they do that speaks to who you are?
I think that an important part of the people I work with, I need to have people who are uncertain. People who are too certain make very bad collaborators. There needs to be an atmosphere of openness in all spheres. If a composer comes and says to us decisively, this is the music I've got, this is what we're using, end of story, that stops work rather than encourages work. If a composer says, I don't have a clue, I don't know what I'm doing, that's also not good. But if there are a series of possibilities, of provisional answers, that's when you can start to say, if we followed this provisional answer, what would it sound like? And I suppose a composer like Philip Miller is so open to the different way sound or music can shift and change. The same with the video editors that I've worked with over the years. For us to say, until very late in the process, there's many different things and many different possible solutions to the set of questions we've asked ourselves. And that's, I think, the way in which the most interesting answers arrive.
Yeah.
You know, there's some writers and some artists that start from certainty. This is a story I have to tell. This is an image that has to be made. And I'm not one of those. I start with, there's an impulse, I know something needs to be made, here's a broad area which I'm interested in looking at, but let's see what can be found within that.
Can we say the same thing about charcoal, which is at the heart?
The thing about charcoal is, which is the primary medium I use, is that it's so changeable. So that you can keep it as tentative and provisional very far down the track as the drawing is made. You know, in the end, the drawing is the final stage when you've stopped working on the sheet of paper. That's how it is. But until that stage, everything is very loose and open, so that it can be a constant conversation between what you think you've made and what you've actually made on the sheet of paper. The same way in a performance, it's a balance between what you think you're going to be seeing and what the actor or performer actually gives you. And one needs to find strategies to be open to that.
What is with the fixation with history? Where does it come in? Yeah.
I suppose for me it's like breathing. I can't imagine what would it be to hold your breath. You know, every breath you take as an artist is a conversation with the world around you, but it's also a conversation with other things that you've seen, that you've read, that you've heard, relating to that. So if you make a drawing, inside you is the history of image making, going back to caves, to Stone Age image making, to the ancient world, to Chinese art, to Europe, to South America. All of those images, to a greater or less extent, sit inside you, and whatever you're drawing is in conversation with them, whether you like it or not. And the same way thinking about current situations is always in terms of examples from the past, shifts from the past. It would be impossible to only think of the future without the future always being described in terms of the past.
Speaking of the past,
yes.
40 years in the space and in the artistic space,
yes.
What does it mean?
It's a long time. It's a long time. It's a lot of I get a shock when I start opening the drawers in my studio and say, things done 40 years. It's a shock because some things are the same now as 40 years ago. It's a shock because many things I've forgotten that I've ever done. It's a shock because sometimes I think, oh my God, when I did that, I knew what I was doing. Why have I forgotten what I was doing then? And it's a shock because the art world has changed, South Africa's changed, the city's changed. So it's, as we know in South Africa, we're stuck in the situation of nothing has changed, everything has changed. It's always astonishing how deeply rooted some things are that will not change, or that have not changed. And that's both distressing, but it's very distressing in the larger sphere of the country, how little has been able to change. But in other cases, we know things are enormously different.
And speaking of the city, I mean, this is your city.
It is my city, which is to say there's a strong love and hate relationship to it. It's extremely distressing when the city behaves badly, as it often does. Where I hate it that it's not a city that you can wander through. So when one travels to other parts of the world and you can say, oh, it's 2 a.m. and I can walk from my hotel across the centre of town to where I want to go, that feels such a relief. And you think, why should that be impossible in Johannesburg? But around many parts of the city we know that's impossible. And that's a distress. But there's an energy and an openness of making, of thinking, of experimentation, of different people coming together that I've not found anywhere else.
When you look at it now, because now this is the largest survey of your work
of the
exhibitions in Cape Town. When you look at it now and look at how things have gotten into place, How do you define this moment in your life?
Well, I would just define it firstly in terms of, for me, it's distressing that this happens in Cape Town and not Johannesburg, but there are not institutions in Johannesburg that could do the exhibition. It's distressing that public institutions are in such a state of disarray that it would be impossible to do it where it should be at the National Gallery or Municipal Gallery. But thank goodness for the private initiatives of Norval, of people who've started the Museum of Contemporary Art in Cape Town, Contemporary African Art in Cape Town, that these facilities exist. And it's possible to do a very strong exhibition in those facilities. But that's a worldwide phenomenon of public poverty and private wealth. Is a phenomenon in the art world, that more and more projects rely on private. But on the larger section, to have a survey to look back over 40 years of work, there are a lot of drawings I hadn't seen for 30 years or more. And a lot of work which at the time I was very distressed with, and I look at it now and saying, God, stop complaining. If you could do work like that now, you'd be happy. Of some of the really early works. The more recent work is more familiar. And it's also interesting to see themes that go through. It's as you talked about history, there is a lot of the work that looks at different corners of colonial history, particularly the Ethiopian War in Abyssinia in Ethiopia, Italian War in Ethiopia in the 1930s, genocide of the Hereros 1904, Africans in the First World War, China in Africa at the moment. These are all kind of projects around which big thematic sections of my work have involved. So if I look back at it over 40 years, you're right, there has been an interest in history as one sphere, and South African history particularly. And then there's also an interest in the making of art, what happens in the studio as a model for how we think and work.
Why should I hesitate? That's an interesting title.
It's a title that came from a person writing about, an African writing about going to the First World War. And a lot of African men were recruited into the First World War, and this was a person saying, why should I hesitate? I'm getting paid a good salary, I've got a good employer, why should I hesitate about going to the war? And then he says, I must have been born a coward. That's it, I must just have been born a coward. So it's about that particular line, why should I hesitate? I hesitate because I'm not sure why I hesitate. So I don't have an answer to what the title means. It's either why should I hesitate? Of course I know what I'm doing here. It is, look at it, I'm not going to hesitate. Or why I should hesitate. I think it has to do with not being definitive. Not trying to say this is the truth and this is the only truth. And I think it's that attitude of this is the only truth in the world which has been so calamitous for us in so many ways. So to place provisionality, uncertainty and doubt as a polemic of what we need in the world is part of the title.